Welcome, listeners, to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Briefs What's Coming Up Next Week in the World podcast. The week starts on Sunday, August 2nd, with energy markets in focus as 7 OPEC Plus countries meet to review production adjustments. That group includes Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, Kazakhstan, Algeria, and Oman. The big question is how much additional oil production comes online and whether the group signals a pause after recent increases. For Moscow, this is always a key watch item because oil revenue remains central to financing the Russian state and its war effort. Russia has spent years building economic shock absorbers, but even the Kremlin cannot rewrite the basic math of energy markets. Then on Tuesday, August 4th, attention shifts to the Middle East, where Lebanon and Israel are scheduled to hold another round of U.S. brokered talks in Italy. These discussions focus on implementation details surrounding the current framework, including Israeli withdrawals, Lebanese armed forces deployments, and Hezbollah's weapons. The experienced observers will be watching the technical details here. In these negotiations, the small things often matter more than the big speeches. A handshake makes the headlines, but timelines, verification mechanisms, and troop movements are where the real story usually lives. Also on Tuesday, the United States releases the latest job openings and labor turnover survey. It is not a national security event on its face, but economic strength is strategic power. These numbers feed into Federal Reserve expectations, the strength of the dollar, and global financial conditions. Countries like Russia and China are watching the same data because U.S. economic resilience remains one of the biggest factors shaping the broader international system. On Wednesday, August 5th, the Bank of Russia releases commentary from its recent monetary policy discussion. This gives analysts a look inside how Moscow's central bank is balancing inflation, government spending, currency pressure, and the economic effects of sanctions and wartime production. Russia has become very skilled at managing messaging around its economy, almost like a carefully produced state media performance. But central bank data tends to reveal the underlying pressure points. Also on Wednesday, China's manufacturing sector gets attention with the release of July private sector manufacturing data. The key question is whether exports continue compensating for weaker domestic demand. Beijing has leaned heavily on industrial production and global trade to maintain momentum. But the challenge remains that a manufacturing powerhouse still needs consumers spending at home. Even the world's second-largest economy cannot simply press a button and reboot like an old computer after a bad update. On Wednesday evening, August 5th Pacific Time, and into Thursday, August 6th, the world turns toward Hiroshima for the annual Peace Memorial Ceremony. The event marks the anniversary of the atomic bombing and comes at a moment when nuclear issues remain unusually prominent. Russia's nuclear signaling, China's expanding arsenal, and North Korea's weapons programs all add weight to the messaging. Expect speeches focused on nuclear risk reduction, deterrence, and the humanitarian consequences of nuclear warfare. On Thursday, August 6th, Myanmar's military leader Min Aung Hlaing begins a visit to Thailand. The trip matters because ASEAN continues trying to manage the fallout from Myanmar's civil conflict while balancing regional stability and relations with China. The public messaging will likely focus on engagement and cooperation, but the deeper question remains whether regional diplomacy can influence a conflict that has continued despite years of outside pressure. Also on Thursday, the United States also releases second quarter productivity and labor cost data. Again, this is an economic indicator with strategic implications. Productivity, inflation, and labor costs influence the Federal Reserve outlook, which affects global markets and the financial environment for governments around the world. The biggest U.S. economic event arrives on Friday, August 7th, with the July employment report. Markets will focus on payroll growth, unemployment, wages, and revisions. For policymakers, this is another piece of the puzzle in deciding whether inflation risks are cooling or whether monetary policy needs to remain tighter for longer. And finally, the watch list for the week. First, the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the biggest potential pressure points. Iran's proposed arrangements for reopening shipping lanes remain unresolved, and any movement could immediately affect energy markets. Second, watch US China trade friction, especially around rare earths, technology restrictions, and agricultural commitments. The two sides continue talking, but the competition beneath those conversations remains very real. And third, keep an eye on Russia and Ukraine. There are no major scheduled diplomatic events, but military activity, sanctions announcements, and political messaging can change quickly. That is what's coming up next week. Thanks for listening. The headlines will keep coming, so we'll keep sorting signal from noise. Find the daily written brief at restrictedhandling.substack.com, and we'll be back with more tomorrow.